because as I'll just go right into my talk on Yesod Foundation, because I as I did my own um, meditation on Yesod, I quickly found my way into pain, and it's not a pain that I want to escape. There's real grief that I feel of what's happened, for a long time, but certainly more acutely on October 7th and the aftermath. So I'm not ready to move through that pain. And maybe it is that I'm holding on to this pain, though I don't feel I'm consciously holding on to it, because something really devastating has happened, and we're not ready to move through it. So I want to share a few layers of how I'm experiencing Yesod. And remember, the reason I'm sharing this with you is I want to give you an example of how I move through the Sfirot. What I don't do is count each day that, the Chesed of Chesed, the Gevur of Chesed, and so forth. I'm not saying you ought not. What I'm saying, after 10, 12 years of doing that, you start to feel like you're doing it in a rote manner. I'm very much influenced, as I wrote in my Shabbat thought, by the Baal Shem Tov's idea that every word is a container of souls and worlds and angels and divinity. And therefore, when we take the Tzohar, the light of consciousness, and place it into the Teva, into the word, we see this deeply animated world within there. And of course, what we're doing is we're also animating those souls and worlds and divinity within us. So in some way, our souls meet the soul of the word. So this is an overtly contemplative practice. And part of it being a contemplative practice is you don't know what you're going to encounter when you go there. So this is not counting the Omer and knowing where I am. I'm using these 7 weeks to go into these, at least the names of the emanations. I mean, I know what they mean. I've studied them enough. And as I sink into it, I encounter souls and worlds and angels, but I don't know which ones are going to become the most present. So when I sat down earlier this week to meditate on Yesod, my foundations, I became aware of my deep attachment to my political foundations. And unfortunately, when we say politics, we tend to think of how you vote and so forth, but I mean politics in the deepest sense of the word. Remember, politics comes from the word polis, which means city, and it came mostly out of the uh, Platonic Aristotelian idea of how we ought to live together. Uh, Plato's Republic, how should the state be organized? Aristotle's idea mostly on what kind of character we should develop in order to support the polis so we could live well together. They both believed that they didn't use the term uh, as strongly as later Roman philosophers did. They believed there was kind of a natural law, a, a way to live together appropriate for our nature. Because our nature is both to be destructive and to construct a city in which we could all live together. So the laws of both how to organize the city and what kind of character we ought to develop these were things of great concern to the Greeks and the Romans. Then they bequeathed to us, as it were, the science of how we ought to live together. And the science of how we ought to live together is very much rooted in our nature as human beings and what's the best way to organize our lives as human beings so we can live together. As you know, for me, this has a few layers. I'll just mention three. One is an absolute understanding in what I call natural law, although it's so misunderstood as the law of nature. I don't like to use that term too much. But the natural law of tradition means in our nature as human beings, there are better and worse ways to live. And we should use reason to figure out the best way to live. So morality and reason go together. I often use the term moral realism, that there actually are better and worse answers to moral questions. And that what we call the liberal state, and here we mean by classical liberalism, not liberal as liberal as opposed to conservative, because classical liberalism encompasses both what you might call center left, center right, although it probably does not include hard left and hard right. So I'll say the great center of center left, center, and center right. So what does the classical liberal state believe? I think these are holy things. We believe in representative government. We believe in the voice of the people. I think our arrangement of having branches of government is probably the ideal to arrange, that we separate government into the legislative, judicial, and executive. A regime of law, and all the things that we somewhat take for granted, uh, by which we organize ourselves and strongly permeated by a regime of rights. Now, we see this in the Bill of Rights, and of course, that does not exhaust all of our rights, but the idea that we have, that the state is there at some level to protect our rights. Not well developed enough in liberal thought is the idea of duty. And I think our framers took for granted that we live in worlds of duty, and we have a duty to protect the rights of the citizens. So I'll say the liberal state, the Enlightenment state, rooted in natural law or moral reasoning, creates a certain way that we live together that takes for granted the world of duty, and then brings to mind especially the regime of rights, especially the rights of minorities and minority points of view. So that's a profound, deep foundation of my thought. I think it's godly. I don't think there's any better way to live. Um, part of my YouTube time, I'm watching Steven Pinker, whom I admire greatly, by the way. He's an atheist that, which I don't understand. I think his atheism is of the rather shallow variety. I think he just feels he has to say he's an atheist because he doesn't want to spend time making sense of moral realism. But Steven Pinker, who's written really wonderful books, and there's a time there where Rabbi Manning and I would oftentimes mention our great appreciation for Steven Pinker. If you haven't read his books, I mean, they're pretty thick. You might want to find a summary. But he really believes that the Enlightenment, which, remember, the Enlightenment which enshrines the liberal state, has made the world better. And he gives all kinds of evidence. Things are getting better and better and better. As well, when people say to me, "Oh, things are so horrible," well, they're actually not as horrible as 1862 and 1942. So, relatively speaking, the world is a much better place than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And why is that? Because of the Enlightenment state. Steven Pinker, and remember, he's a person of what you might call the political left. He says that there's one word that we can point to that contributes to the world getting better, and that is America. The fact that a liberal Enlightenment state emerged from the Second World War, for all of our nation's faults, had a profound influence on creating democracies in Western Europe, right, and in the Western Hemisphere, and ultimately in Eastern Europe. That's due to America. America is the gold standard for improving the human condition. Now, he has other books as well, and so again, I don't agree with him. I believe he's a moral realist. He won't accept that, because then if you're a moral realist, you have to give a criterion. By what do I answer my moral questions? That's a very significant idea. Whenever you hear somebody make a moral claim that something is right or something is wrong, if you want to, you can say, according to what standard? Now, what you find is some of the most judgmental people about right and wrong cannot answer that question because they don't want to enter into the idea that there's a metaphysical standard for moral better and worse. They don't know how to answer that. So they slip in something morally right or morally wrong, but can't answer the question according to what? Because if it's only according to their opinion, then there is no thing as truly morally right or morally wrong. There are just people with different opinions. Now, so they don't mean that. They don't mean my opinion is as good as this person whom I hate's opinion. They think their opinion is better. So when they push, they say, well, it's just my opinion. I say, well, it doesn't sound like it. It sounds like you're fighting for your opinion, and they're wrong. And so on one hand, they want to be relativists, but they really aren't. So if I look at Steven Pinker, if I sat in the room with him, I say, Steven Pinker, better according to what? You have some theory of the good. If the world's getting better, you must have a theory of the good. Is that just your opinion? Where they typically say some kind of utilitarian thing. There's something called the human good. I say, okay. And can you demonstrate that that actually is good as opposed to just saying that it's good? Now we're getting into the in kind of the inner workings of moral theory, which most people don't spend time with. Um, but again, if Steven Pinker says the world is getting better, he has some theory of the good. If you say to him, justify your theory of the good, he says, well, it's good for human beings. So he's back to using the word under question. This is a kind of a circular reasoning. So I'm listening to Steven Pinker, and he's in conversation with Yuval Harari. So you know that I don't think a lot of Yuval. I mean, he's a very smart guy. There's no doubt about that. So he says to Steven Pinker, who's actually promoting the idea that the Enlightenment worldview, the liberal state, has been the greatest benefit to humankind. Yuval Harari says, well, it's on its last gas. The air is running out. The Enlightenment worldview is going to end. And I looked at Steven Pinker. They're sitting in chairs across from each other. And I tried to read his face. He held it together pretty well. And he's a respectful guy. I think he wanted to say, you better hope not. You sound kind of transgressive and naughty that the whole Enlightenment thing is going to end. And I picked that up in other books of his, which is why I don't like his books, but because his books have a kind of a moral superiority about them, that all of our ideas of morality are just subjective. They don't have any objective reality. Um, and I think to myself, well, you're a wealthy guy sitting in London, and you can talk about that these things aren't real. However, when it came to coming to Israel to talk about the judicial reforms, boy, did he take a position. I want to ask him, well, if it's all subjective and nothing's real, what are you so mad about? So he's another person that I think, on one hand, likes to make a name for himself on this kind of cultural pessimism, but when he has to take a side, he's very emphatic. So when I think of my foundations, I would agree with Steven Pinker if you wanted to find one person. So then, and Steven Pinker, by the way, is another person who's profoundly sad about what neo-Marxism, so-called DEI, has done to the institution. He's been at Harvard his entire intellectual life, and he really thinks it's been utterly destructive of the project of the modern university, which is to teach Enlightenment values. And he really sees it as a destructive ideological dictatorship, to the point that students and professors are afraid, as if there's an inquisition, and they'll be drummed out of the university, which has happened in some places. So if you want to, go on YouTube and find someone who's articulating this point of view, that this, I say so-called because DEI has nothing to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a neo-Marxist ideology that sees the world divided only into oppressors and victims, and they decide who is who. And of course, in this, Israel has become the oppressor in chief, and Palestinians have become the victims in chief. By extension, oppressors can do no right, and victims can do no wrong. Now, you'll see this in the charter of Hamas. A Jew can be sitting on the beach in Tel Aviv and committing an act of violence. A Hamas terrorist can invade Israel and slaughter people, and that's not called violence, it's called liberation. So the so-called colonizers, which is a bizarre term, because to be a colony, there has to be a state that sends the colonists. Colonists are in service of the state where they came. There is no colonization of Israel, but they have to use the term because that's the term you need to use. And so this neo-Marxian, neo-colonialism idea, which again permeates DEI, which students have been persuaded of, is the intellectual milieu of October 7th and the aftermath. Wait for the you know why that's such a great sound? The planes start up again about at 5 o'clock in the morning, because there are a time when no one was flying to Israel. And So all of a sudden, 5 o'clock in the morning, I hear the jet's going to go, yay! The jets are coming over. Come on, bring another one. We're right in the flight path from the Mediterranean over to the Ben Gurion Airport. So that's a good sound. I don't mind planes flying over at 5 o'clock in the morning. In any case, this DEI, this neo-Marxism, um, you know, under the false flag that they care about diversity, equity, inclusion, and they don't. They're actually into excluding voices of anybody who believes in the Enlightenment, who believes, well, let's have free speech. Everybody gets to speak. One does not get to say, well, you've spoken long enough. Now it's our turn to speak. That's not called free speech. That's called excluding people. It's not fair and is definitely not diverse. So Steven Pinker bemoans this. And so what saddens me so greatly, if I truly believe in the values of the Enlightenment that I believe are godly, I believe this is the Enlightenment is a godly idea. I think it's produced by godly people. Um, to see Western Europe especially fall under the sway, consciously or not, of this neo-Marxism, they are therefore not able to engage in two essential parts of Enlightenment thinking that I want to share with you. One is that factual claims need to be validated. Factual claims need to be validated. If you're going to say a fact about the world, it's not true because you say it, it's true because you can go through the careful process of validation. Now, I sometimes say things here in Israel that you almost can't say to people on the political left who very much identify with the sufferings of the Palestinians. And when they talk about the famine there and the food distribution, I say, how do you know? How do you know what's happening there? How can you verify your factual claim? And of course, you can't because there's no free press in Gaza. In fact, it seems to be that much of the food aid that went before was taken by Gaza and taken by Hamas and put into their underground caverns. The question is there food in Gaza? There might be plenty. It's just not getting out to the people because Hamas has stolen it and then sells it to people. So now the question, I think, is again, from what I'm reading, and I've seen enough verification that it might be true that the food that went in before is controlled by Hamas. Again, I haven't personally verified it, but I've seen enough. So I say to people, well, have you also heard reports that the prior food aid was hijacked by Hamas, taken into the tunnels that still exist, and sold at a profit? Of course, a profit because they got it for free. And people say, yes, I've heard of that, and then they say there's not enough and it's too much. I say, there's anytime you are behind an idea, the people you don't like is, too little, too late, too short, not enough. I really get that. That's part of argumentation. So when I see the European states say, well, there's a starvation, there's a famine, I've been hearing this since before October 7th when they said there was a strangling blockade of Gaza and they're near starvation. Now, I knew there wasn't a blockade. I knew there wasn't because there's no evidence whatsoever. I'm sorry, blockade. There's no evidence for anybody starving in Gaza. Why? Because I actually searched very carefully for people who were reporting from Gaza and going down the streets and actually showing the bustling streets of Gaza City, shops full to the brim. So as far as I could see, there wasn't any famine or starvation in Gaza. So Hamas created a curated view of famine and suffering that the Western world, by the way, not Eastern Europe, Western Europe, just assumed was correct. And I remember when I would say to some of my friends, I would say, I don't believe it. I don't believe that there is famine. I don't believe there's starvation. I don't believe these casualty figures because they would talk about casualty figures. I remember when I read a study, that there'd be 250 people killed every day. I said, war doesn't work like that. You don't have an even line on a graph. And in what battles? What's the verification? What about, well, the Gaza Health Ministry, meaning Hamas. So people say, well, you don't think people died in war? I say, I believe people died in war, but I think it's mostly combatants. Israelis, soldiers don't massacre civilians, and such a charge as that has to be verified. Well, if you ask anybody who believes in these casualty figures, can you please verify that? they can't. What do? They get angry instead. And I've seen some people on Facebook that I haven't unfriended, but I'm very upset with them that they throw out a number, no attempt to verify, and then just lambast Israel. And that's not good for the liberal state. That's not good for the Enlightenment. That uh, dis opinions that demonize another person or group of people are taken as fact without any attempt to go through the enlightened reasoning idea of verification of facts. In fact, a big part of what Steven Pinker works on is why people believe weird things, why people believe wrong things. It's an hour of YouTube. It's really excellent. He gives all the reasons in the world that you could probably produce why people believe things they have not verified, but believe it very strongly. He says because it doesn't have anything to do with how they live their lives. Meaning you can believe anything. If it has to do with is your car running, your way to work, you probably want to be able to verify the fact. If you want to demonize some group of people, it doesn't interfere with your world. You get to identify with your tribe. You get to hate, which is a very strong impulse in people. So people believe things they don't verify for all kinds of reasons because it doesn't matter to their day-to-day living. I think I remember when I first heard that Israel was going through a fascist takeover, that democracy was under assault. I was in the States and I called our daughter. I said, "Is something happening in Israel?" They said, "No." I said, "No, I just read someone who I respect said that, there's been a fascist takeover." I said, "Daddy, I'm looking out the window, like everything's the same." I said, "What about the news?" He said, "Well, they say it, but I don't know what it means because, like, there's still newspapers and the news is running, and does a fascist takeover mean that they stop the news?" And I say, "But this is so odd because I like these people and trust these people." I called several people in Israel. Is there a fascist takeover? They said, "No, everything's normal except people claiming there's a fascist takeover." I thought to myself, why would they do that? Okay, I knew why they would do it. So you can navigate your life in Israel as if there is no fascist takeover, because there isn't. However, if you say there's a fascist takeover, there are certain benefits that accrue, especially the destabilization of the Likud government. So I get it. Yeah, everything is fair game in politics, except it's not true. So now here was my question is, to what degree do we violate the ideals of the liberal state in order to force a change in government? It's a very serious idea. Meaning you're saying the current government is so bad, I can violate the laws of the Enlightenment state, which is say things that are not verifiable. I think in the hurly-burly world of politics, it's very accepted among people. I don't like it. And I think I'm a minority view here in Israel. We shouldn't say things that are not verifiable. And if you think it's verifiable, verify it. Well, that's not how people conduct their business. I think anywhere in the world, this is a small country, so maybe it feels worse here. The second thing about moral statements, factual statements need to be verified. If anybody claims something to be factual, ask them to verify it. If somebody claims something to be right or wrong, ask them um, to argue it, as in reason it. Meaning reasoning has to do with overarching values, and you walk down through a set of facts as the values, and then you end up with a judgment. So if someone says you the Gaza war is wrong, say, okay, well, let's discuss just war theory. Are there things such as just wars? Or it says, yes, what kinds of wars are just wars? And then you actually get to the point where um, Hamas's war is just because it's liberating from a colonial state. So it is just from this perspective to attack Israel and massacre people. It is unjust for Israel to fight back. This is really what people think. And so when you ask a person to give moral reasoning argumentation, I know it's asking a lot, but if anybody ever claims that something is right or wrong, you can say, could you argue it from premises? Like, what's your major premise? Is there something called a just war, or anything? Someone says something is wrong. Say, okay, well, what's your core moral idea? And a reasoning person, Pinker talks about this, can reason from a premise, and then step by step authenticate the claim. You can't verify factually a moral claim, but you can certainly argue a moral claim based on premises. Let me give you an example. Who owns the land here? People say Palestinians own the land, the Jews own the land. My response is that cannot be verified. You can't do a soil test. It's a moral claim. And when you have a moral claim, you have to start with some kind of premise. One premise of the Palestinians is our ancestors have lived here. So my question is, when did Palestine become Muslim and Arabic speaking? Well, around the 12th century. And so does that mean that therefore the population, the language, the religion, cannot change? What rule of history is that? Well, there's no rule of history that says one group that's invaded and colonized, now they're there permanently, and no other group can emigrate to that group. I mean, it's just a completely fallacious idea. But when I ask people could you please reason this idea, which I think from an enlightenment perspective, we have moral premises, we should reason to a moral conclusion. These are my foundations, and I very much want all our listeners here to think about this idea. Facts have to be verified. Moral statements have to be argued to a valid conclusion. Most of us are not trained to do that. I have found, by the way, I want to learn. When someone tells me that something's really wrong, I say, could you verify it for me? Could you argue it for me? And I think people have just gotten out of the habit of verifying factual claims and arguing moral claims. Verifying factual claims, arguing moral claims, because we live in our echo chambers of people who agree with us, where no one will ever ask you to verify a factual claim or argue a moral claim if everybody already agrees. It's only when they talk to somebody else who doesn't agree or is not sure that they are asked to do it, and they're completely untrained in this. So that's my foundation. Now, because the world has not been lived, the world, I'll say intellectuals, the press, has not been living by these foundations, they've allowed this, what I'll call the neo-Marxist liberation theology rhetoric, to really go unchallenged, which of course ends up in the assassination of the 2 Israeli staff in Washington, D.C. What does the guy say? As a way to free Gaza. Now, you could ask, how does the murder of these 2 staffers of the Israeli embassy free Gaza? Well, they're oppressors by definition. These 2 young people are oppressors, and every oppressor you kill adds to the liberation of Palestine. So murder of Israelis, and by the way, that's why Hamas invaded, was to murder Israelis. They didn't liberate any land. They just wanted to murder Israelis. Also derail the Abraham Accords. That's for another time. So murder is a moral act because Israel's existence is immoral. Therefore, every murdered Israeli is therefore accrues to the so-called moral agenda of liberating Palestine. Now, this is disgusting for me, but you remember after October 7th, how many professors, how many universities broke out in glee that Israel had been attacked and people had been massacred. That fits in with their agenda. Now, there is, from a moral perspective, this is despicable. It's disgusting. So then the question is, maybe I'll talk about this next time when we go into Malchut, why people believe despicable, disgusting things. And Steven Pinker talks about that a lot, and I'd like to maybe end our counting of the Omer with that. So when I meditated on Yesod, I became very, very sad that for me, the foundations of the earth, the foundations of civilization, as it were, I mean, the pillars of civilization are under assault. And people are being, on October 7th, people are being murdered. And, I don't think any Israeli, I've never heard an Israeli say, at least to my face, that they want to kill Palestinians. They want to end this war. They may not care very much about Palestinians because they did declare war on us. But I haven't heard any bloodlust. I haven't heard anybody say we need to, exterminate Palestinians. I mean, there's Israeli Arabs or Palestinians. They're living right by us. We see them every day. You get an operation in the hospital, right? Half the people that I met when I got my back surgery was, Israeli Arabs or Palestinians. There's, people, we get along great here. So Israel's not, if Israel were genocidal against Palestinians, we'd start at home where it would be easier. We're not, there's no interest in that, but people just claim it, and people say, oh, well, that must be true because somebody claimed it. So for me, the foundations of moral reasoning, of a factual reality, that we have a common language. The only way we can survive in the so-called city is we have a common language of verifiable facts, moral claims that can be reasoned and argued, and find out exactly where we disagree and why. Uh, for much of the Western world, especially interestingly in the universities and in journalism, one thing again I see Israel that I'm very upset by is that the news sites don't seem to have any conception of verifying factual claims or reasoning through moral claims. It just the practice does not seem to exist here. I don't. There must be journalism schools here that teach that, and then they forget it the day they walk out of the classroom. So this makes me very sad. As I meditate on this, I got really, really super sad. What I would realize is how much I deeply care about the foundations for the liberal state. I really care to the core of my soul, meaning if there's something, if the soul has political considerations, this is it for me. Is that the salvation of the world relies on the liberal state. There's no exaggeration there. Without the liberal state, it's all going to be like Russia or China or North Korea. Okay, that's the other side. And then you have the Enlightenment state, as it were, trying to hold its ground. So therefore, what do I do with this sadness? And especially after the assassination of those two young people, the sadness was certainly increased into a personal sadness when I think about these young Israelis staffing embassies throughout the world and their lives being in danger. And what can we do? And my proposal, not the only one, I think there's a great center here in Israel, is be kind to each other. We're all under assault. We don't need to attack each other and defame each other and engage in vitriolic, you know, verbal attacks. We can calm ourselves down, and even with people who we disagree, say, well, there's a way that people who disagree talk. And I have found there are many more people here in Israel willing to do that than one would imagine, as long as one says, can we do this thing called verifying facts and arguing morals? I mean, reasoning morals. Can we do that? And people say, yeah, sure. I'm not used to it, but happily. And conversations go entirely differently. So I think this has to be a cultural thing, right? And I know it was very difficult when we lived in the States, with people there, and it's something I've talked about incessantly since October 7th. Master these kind of enlightenment ideals of verifying facts and reasoning moral questions. It calms people down. It gets them in touch with, a verified factual reality and a reasoned moral reality, instead of people getting away with saying anything they wanted as if it were true and making any moral claim as if it were true just because they said it. Now, so I not by the way, I wish I said, and my other foundations are, I didn't get anywhere. I've gone through has love and justice and truth and beauty and prophecy, and I've got so many levels. I got stuck here. I got stuck here. The foundations are strong, but they've been shaken. They've been shaken continuously, but especially since October 7th, especially here. So therefore, what do? Commit myself to these values, commit myself to these foundations. Think like a reasonable person. One's in favor of reasonability, then act reasonable. Verify your facts. Make a case for your morals. Just don't say I'm reasonable, therefore anything I say is factual and anything I think is reasonable. It's actually not true. And I want to offer this to you. And I'll say a last thing. When I move back from that, back to my non-political wisdom works, it's one thing I find in discourse between people, how quickly we lose our ability to reason when we're upset, when we're angry. This is the whole reasoning behind the virtue practice. when people's emotions, conquer their capacity to reason, we say very hurtful things to each other, and it destroys the fabric of relationships. There is a connection between these Enlightenment ideals and personal character. By the way, have you ever heard of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics? That's his whole point. What he calls what I'll call the ideal city state cannot be maintained if people don't exhibit good character. Sounds kind of obvious, right? It is so profoundly true. He wrote the Nicomachean Ethics, which is a brilliant book. It's a short book, brilliant book on character development, especially making the point, if we want the city to survive, we have to cultivate character. If you want the family to survive, if you want relationships to survive, any group of human beings to survive, you have to cultivate character. And from character, from good, what they used to call the ethical character, then go ahead and make your discuss the facts and make your moral claims. All right, that's my teachings on Yesod tonight. My commitment to more or less natural law, Aristotelian Enlightenment ideas of rationality and factual living, and keep the human good before us always, and do everything we can to promote and protect the good.